It's a great pleasure to be here. And also with this topic, which is a little bit experimental for me as well. So if you don't like it, you can blame Peter, who has asked for this topic. I'll try today to give you a little bit of an overview of two case studies of structured deposition in the Neolithic. We can discuss this term later on because it is contested, but it's the closest, I think, the closest I've come to describing what it is that we have been looking at. So it's going to be the Linearbandkeramik on the one hand, where deposits are kind of a very variable thing and generally have this very small scale dimension as well. And then I'm going to look at a case study from the Younger Neolithic that is much more publicly oriented at a larger scale. And where I think we see a tension in how structured deposits function between trying to create a kind of community and maybe also trying to help potential aggrandizers, maybe. All right? And the big question uniting the two of them is to ask whether structured deposits, how they function in society, are they something that keeps the status quo going, or are they perhaps more subversive in one way or another? Just to remind you, the Linearbandkeramik, of course, is the early Neolithic, and then we're going to look at this sort of, here is quite a long box, this Younger Neolithic in Bavaria, but actually we're going to start approximately kind of there. This dating is very optimistic, so it's really sort of here that we will be looking at in southern Germany. So the Bandkeramik one is a longer term, a larger scale case study, and then it's one site from the Younger Neolithic we'll be looking at in Bavaria. Now, deposits in the LBK are not widely studied. There are certain kinds of deposits that are deposits that come in enclosure sites, for example. They have seen a little bit more study, and a little bit, there has been publications on axe hoards, largely to see them as a kind of precursor to a much more well-understood Bronze Age depositional practice that you see a reconstruction of here from the UK. But effectively, the idea that these axe hoards are kind of status indicators and that individual men or small groups of men would deposit their most valued possessions, weapons, in the landscape. But there is a much wider spectrum of deposition. In the sort of 2000s, work on this started, especially in the Paris Basin, where grinding stone deposits were formulated as a new set. There's a sort of recurring practice around longhouses of the Bandkeramik to deposit several grinding stones, often upside down on top of their rubbing stones. And this is really a very regional pattern. In Austria, Eva Lenneis and others have discussed pits on burial grounds that have the same shape as a burial pit, but that don't contain skeletal remains, and just objects that are also arranged in slightly different patterns than they would be if there had been a skeleton. These she has interpreted as cenotaphs, but other people have since argued that maybe these are remains of commemorative feasts, for example. So a little bit of this discussion started to emerge sort of in the 2000s and 2010s, but it is very scattered. In general, most people, maybe also because it's mostly us Germans who study it, see the Linearbandkeramik as a very common sense kind of culture. You know, they're mostly about establishing agriculture, and we don't like to speak so much, at least where I come from, about the ritual aspect of this whole thing. It's something that we feel we can't quite grasp. And so I think this phenomenon has gone a little bit underreported. I first noticed it, and I put this slide here just so you won't kill me at the end, when I was trying to put together a database for burial analysis. And I was going also through all the cenotaphs, and I was also going through all the settlement burials. And I noticed that in some of the sites, there were other kinds of deposits as well that struck me as a little bit strange. Okay? So I started to record them in a database that was actually meant for something different. And that was actually for a specific project that was looking at certain regions. Okay, so this means that data I present you today, even though I've tried to expand it, is still regionally a little bit patchy. And and it's a little bit of a random collection. For example, I could not yet include the rich material from the nicely preserved wells in Saxony. In addition, though, a second problem was that a lot of the deposits are described in earlier sources, and often they are described in a very patchy kind of way. So somebody might mention that in this pit they found 3 complete vessels. But there's no photograph, there is no drawing, and they don't tell you if those vessels are deposited together or in different layers, if there's some kind of chronological development there, or if it's just all one deposition, for example. So much of these data are difficult to interpret, and I'm sure that I've tried to remove all those cases that are not well documented, but this means that it's very much now the tip of the iceberg, and probably you will find many more, or even be reminded of many more. And as a last sort of theoretical caveat to the whole thing, of course, with the structured deposits in the literature, in the archaeological literature, the interpretation very often when people use this term, especially also in Britain, structured deposition means that it's supposed to be ritual deposition. But this is obviously a second step in the interpretation. And in any case, I think most of you are well aware that in many societies, or we can assume in most prehistoric societies, there isn't really a strict separation between what is everyday or what is profane from what is sacred. This has most recently, for me anyway, been summarized by Marshall Salins in this book here, where he talks about an immanentist worldview. Okay, so there is no separate realm of the spirits or gods, but what we have is the life force, the ancestors, the spirits, whatever, are inherent in everything that we do, in all the plants and all the animals in the world around. And even when people do very everyday tasks like gardening, right, they are not just gardening, they're in a sense applying spiritual energy or channeling the spiritual energy of the ancestors, like, for example, in the Trobriand gardens in the Pacific, where there is a lot of garden magic, like Bronislaw Malinowski first studied. So in that sense, of course, there isn't really much point, one could argue, in pulling out a structured deposit as different from something everyday. So, but what I think we can do as archaeologists in order to try and make this aspect of life also a little bit more visible is to try and define a little bit the gradations, because there are gradations of formality and of how exceptional any behavior is. And it's a sliding scale, but I think to give up on it completely would mean that we give up on trying to understand what these belief systems might have been based on. Still, though, it is, of course, a very experimental, right, interpretation in the end. So how I tried to solve this for the database is that I tried to identify 4 criteria, and at least 2 of these had to be fulfilled for a deposit to be called, for me, structured. And this does not necessarily immediately mean that it is ritual, but there are some patterns that I'm going to present to you that suggest there is indeed structure, however we then want to interpret it. We can do that together at the end. So what I used was that the objects needed to be complete, right, or deliberately arranged nicely, right, in either stacked or in a circle or something that was quite clearly deliberate. There needed to be an element of repetition, so either many objects of the same kind deposited together, or the exact same practice repeated, or very similar practice repeated several times on the same site in similar circumstances. Or it needed to be an absolutely unique thing, right? So 2 of these criteria had to be fulfilled for it to count. I very rarely used the unique objects thing, but I used it, for example, for this one, which is an example from Lower Saxony, where there is a triton shell, so imported from the sea, it's quite far from the sea, that was deposited with all these flint flakes and tools stuffed inside it. So this is quite clearly very unusual for me. So I used this one. I excluded the so-called suspiciously rich pits, as Johanna Ritter has identified them. Those are the pits that, if you've been on an LBK site, you might have been lucky enough to excavate, where there is a lot of finds. Sometimes there is more finds than soil, the finds can be very unusual, but there isn't any patterning in the deposits. It's all just stuffed in. And so I excluded these also because very often they're not, all the material is fragmented and it's not presented in such a way to be easily entered into this database. But this is an additional phenomenon we need to keep in mind. Okay. Even with these allegedly clear criteria that I made for myself, there were some ambiguous examples. So these are just a couple of examples of things I have excluded. For example, if there was just one complete pot in a pit, like here in Billany, I have not counted it because this could be anything. Right? And it's only the one, and in the book I only found the one example. So this is excluded, but it's not to say that there wasn't any significance attached to this. Okay. Similarly, this is an example from Alsace, from Rosheim, and I think, there were several recurring layers of these. Can you see that? No, you can't because I've extended. Of this very heavily burned residue, so a nicely layered fill. And it had fragments of figurines in it, and it had fragments of unusual vessels in it. So it was a very rich material, but it wasn't arranged, and nothing of it was complete. So this is a kind of borderline suspiciously rich pit that I have not put in. Okay, so as I say, it's really the tip of the iceberg that I have included. So this map is based on the material up to about 2022. I think. So it's 145 deposits. I've found a few more since, but if you have any more that you're aware of, please send me answers on a postcard. I always happily take these. Or just in an email, to be fair. And this is like the mapping of the structured depositions in relation to cemetery sites or burial grounds, which we also have in this area. And as you can see, while the burial grounds are kind of restricted in scope to certain regions, the deposits are quite widely spread, and they cover more or less the whole of the LBK phenomenon. There are some omissions like here, largely because I have excluded many of these borderline cases. I found a couple since then. And there's not so much there, largely because I don't speak Polish, unfortunately. So there are linguistic problems remaining. But I think it's quite clear that it is a very widespread phenomenon. And in that, this is indicative figures by now, but the main pattern has not changed. So in that, there are clear hotspots of where people do a lot of this kind of depositional practice. And this is largely also where an issue of reporting and of large-scale excavations where a lot of a settlement, for example, has been opened up. So again, I would not take this so very, very seriously, but I was quite surprised to see so many here, even if I haven't entered the wells, so many up here in the central eastern German area, and then also in northern Bavaria. That was a bit of a surprise. That there is very much rich material from this region, I was much less surprised about. So in general, and the new sites haven't really changed so much about it, what is most represented in these deposits, they occur in two kinds. They can either be deposits of just one single kind of artifact, for example, just polished stone tools, or very often they can be mixed deposits of several different kinds of things. So these are instances of how many times a certain material appears. Okay, so a mixed deposit will be counted several times here. But pottery stands out as being very, very frequent and very important. And then we have a big spike here also for grinding stones and for deposits of animal bone. These are mostly not complete animals, although there are a few of them, but things like bucrania or halves of animals, those kinds of things. A little bit of bone tools, but there were very few, so I haven't counted them here separately. And then we have the polished stone tools, which also occur often in their own kinds of hoards. Much less frequent is the chipped stone tools, and then there's a wide variety of things that occur like 2 or 3 times. So figurines, actually these are very rare. Shells, ornaments, also very rare. Bits of burned, layers of burned cereals, etc., etc. But just 1 or 2 examples of each. So my first question was, is this similar or different to what ends up with human remains? So is this a different kind of practice? Or are we maybe looking at a burial rite where the skeletal remains have not survived, for example? So comparing this to the cemetery burials that I had actually been paid to collect, don't tell my employer that I was looking at structured deposits in the meantime. So looking at the cemetery burials, we see that some of the things are similar, right? So pots are very important in both, the polished stone tools are important in both, but the cemetery burials in green here also stand out because that's where the chipped stone material is, and that's obviously where the ornaments are, because they are on the individual body. Okay? But the structure, what we call structured deposits in this, stand out a lot because the grinding stones and the animal bones are far, far more common here than they are on cemetery sites. And that's all the more so if you think that these grinding stones, people often use the same word, but the ones in burials are often much smaller and are supposed to be sort of little pellets for grinding of ochre, whereas the grinding stones and the structured deposits are always the big ones for actually grinding cereals. So that already made them stand out as a little bit unusual, and in a sense is representing the sort of agricultural dimension of existence that actually in most of the grave goods normally is not really symbolically referenced very much. Similar issue with the settlement burials, really. So even there, the settlement burials have a lot fewer polished stone tools. That's often because there are more women and children represented on these settlement burial sites, but also because in general they have just fewer stone tools. We also see that here. The pottery, again, similar. The ornaments, again, this is mostly driven by the Paris Basin data, but settlement burials can have a lot of ornaments in them. And again, here, the animal bone and the grinding stone stand out from our structured deposits. And as I said, in this case, also more of the polished stone tools. So it's a practice that is separate from burial rites. I think we could conclude, or I concluded with some confidence. I don't know if you agree. I then looked at these cenotaphs that Lennice and others had noted on their cemetery sites to see whether they stand out from the deposits that came from settlement sites and from out in the landscape. And here again, it's a little bit mixed. So we have deposits with humans, isolated human bones, partial burials, like for example this one here from Quedlinburg, where you have the child's skull in a vessel with the nice amphora on top, and then this vessel associated with it. So should we count this more as a burial, or is this actually a structured deposit? So the partial burials again stand out as being a little bit different to most of the cemetery and settlement burials. So, but they're kind of in between. Right? They're often associated with animal bone, and they're often associated with flint tools, which if you are so minded, if you watch a lot of horror films, you might choose to associate that with butchery of some description. So the cenotaphs, in a sense, are a lot more similar to what you would find on your average cemetery site, but they don't have so many flint tools. And the partial burials stand out for this reason, this flint-animal combination. So they're sort of an in-between thing, and I'm still not really sure where I should group them, whether they're more like a burial-oriented behavior or a general deposition-oriented behavior. So these remain a little bit liminal for me. But in some, the structured deposits from settlement sites are a distinctive kind of practice that focuses on these agricultural and subsistence food-producing concerns that we otherwise rarely see. So you can see the grinding stones and the animal bones that are the main focus here. So this, in a sense, makes them a little bit of a wide field. Right? Many of them seem to be quite small scale and a little bit inexpensive. You have a few pots, they're not necessarily nice pots. You have the grinding stones that are often very heavily used, and you have the animal bone. Right? And then you have axe deposits that are separate. But it's not the sort of investment of, let's say, spondylus shells and ornaments and nice big stone tools that you see in the cemetery site, comparatively. If you look a little bit more at the different kinds, so we said the pottery dominates, and very often it is also kind of storage vessels or quite coarse ware. Again, here the descriptions are not always very clear, but this works. There's many undecorated vessels, so it's quite a different selection compared to what goes into graves very often. And this can also be associated with traces of burning, preparation of the pit. Sometimes there are smashed vessels at the bottom that are creating a little carpet, and so on. And pottery is ubiquitous across. What is a little bit more discussed in the literature, like we said, are deposits that only have one kind of item because they stand out, and of those, the polished stone tools have received the most attention by Jeunesse and by Quitter and by others. And also there's a little bit of a literature on the animal bones, right? And the Paris basin grinders. But what we haven't really looked at much is the deposits that combine several materials into one, the so-called mixed deposits. Okay. But there are some quite striking examples of these as well. So this is one from Saxony-Anhalt. And as you can see from the scan, this was reported quite a long time ago. This was in the 1950s, I think. And there is a very interesting Stichbandkeramik ditch with really weird dead people that is not mentioned anywhere. Under it, in the report, under it is a series of LBK structured deposits. So you see this very square, large pit here, which is also quite unusual in its shape. And in one corner of it was a grinding stone, one of the big ones for cereal grinding, deposited upside down over its rubbing stone, and covered by the sherds of a vessel that was smashed in situ, and that could be reconstructed as this sort of anthropomorphic vessel. And also the rest of the pit was very rich in finds. There were big charcoal layers, etc. Okay, and then, big square in the middle. Oh yes, and there was also a storage vessel that could be reconstructed from the sherds in the remainder of the fill. Right, but then either side of this large central pit, smaller circular pits were dug, and they had the same sort of arrangement, even though not quite so much material as the main one, but always a grinding stone upside down in one part of the pit and covered with the sherds of several vessels, but at least one of which could always be reconstructed. There's another sort of bottle-shaped one here, and then a comb on the bottom. Right, so and this part with the grinding stone and the sherds was always very carefully arranged, and then the rest of the pit was filled in with this more general waste that may or may not relate to this deposit. But this was quite a striking example. It's a shame that we don't really know how long in time it took to make this arrangement. So are these all exactly contemporary, or do people come back here time and time again to perform this ritual? And also, how public is it? You know, once we get a nice enclosure ditch, we can think maybe of many people gathering and witnessing these rituals, but what about these pits underneath? And this is a question that's even more pertinent, I think, for this settlement site, Buchbrunn in Franconia, where we had a high peak of such deposits in northern Bavaria. So this site was only very partially excavated, but it contained some very, very large houses, at least in the regional context. And several deposits, and the most elaborate one comes from this house here, house 15. Which is quite weird, like it has these outside trenches that we're not quite sure how to interpret. Is it some kind of repair or whatever? But in the middle was a pit, exactly here in this, between the post rows, that contained, again, several layers of burning interspersed with clean laths and with sherds and other kinds of that, you know, domestic detritus material. But then a little bit higher up was a complete pot that was deposited, and also this very nice double axe head. Okay. And the excavator has interpreted this pit as a kind of as a ritual of closure for the house, a kind of burial for the house when it was finally abandoned. Important possessions would be left behind there. But even without going into this very, very specific detail, it's interesting because once we accept that this one is a structured deposit, there's also several others on this site where similar sequences are found, but either with the axe or with the pot, okay? And not with both. Right? But because we have this combination here with two complete artifacts, I think we can recognize these others also as a similar kind of practice, and they're all placed inside houses, even though they are in various parts of the house. So perhaps a sort of local tradition that is developing just here. And that's something that in this corpus we've noticed several times, that there are specific combinations that on one side or another side prove very, very popular. And people seem to recreate this time and time again, and they will start to differ a little bit from other sites, even in the same region, precisely in how they carry out these kinds of structured deposits. Okay. So I think in sum what we can see is a sort of degrees of formality in this depositional practice that are valid for both the human remains and for our sort of mixed deposits. Right, so at one end we have these partial burials that can occur with a little bit with everything, and there's a lot of animal bone and a lot of butchery waste and so on. And they perhaps have their correspondence in the suspiciously rich pits where nothing seems to be quite arranged. Right? A little step up is the settlement burials, where perhaps there are not so many people attending, and this could be similar for our structured deposits from settlement sites, which are often, or which can be in pits inside the house or in relatively small features, not necessarily, but for a restricted kind of audience. And then we have the big display on a cemetery, for example. We can envisage a wider audience, and this could be where we have larger scale deposits at enclosures, but also perhaps these single material hoards like the axe hoards that are often found away from the settlement as well. We've not yet talked so much about location. Most of these deposits that I've catalogued come from settlements. But again, the question is why this is the case. Like, is this a bias in where we excavate and where we record? And this may, of course, be the case because sometimes people are lucky enough to also identify similar deposits in the landscape. So again, in Franconia, there's some of these very striking rock formations. In English, you'd say a tor or a tower, right? A rock tower. And at several of these, it appears that LBK people climbed to the top and then threw stuff down. It must have been great fun. So there's accumulations of things here, and then sometimes also in little crevasses in the rock. So they seem to use these very striking natural places that often also have little caves and fissures in them to deposit similar kinds of materials, pottery and polished stone tools mainly. Okay. Of course, there's the material from the wells that really I need to get my teeth in, where we have many exceptional objects. But we also have sometimes springs. So this one here, the Ruhmequelle, again in Lower Saxony. It doesn't look like much on this photograph, but it has one of the highest water volumes that are coming from the ground, that are welling up out of the ground. And there's a lot of LBK artifacts that have been found in this part of the landscape. They're not so well published because there's a lot of Bronze Age and Iron Age stuff that was the actual focus of the archaeological intervention. But it seems that from the Neolithic, people have recognized this area as quite special. Sometimes there's also deposits on river terraces, overlooking the river, on the edges of boggy ground, that kind of thing. But I think this is very much underrepresented in our material simply because of where we excavate at Linearbandkeramik sites. So one question to look for in the future is perhaps more landscape work. People in the 50s and 60s did a good amount of work on caves, for example, and they report several things that sound suspiciously like structured deposits, but that are not reported to modern standards, and so where it's very difficult to really evaluate this material. But I'm wondering also, given the the agricultural component of many of these deposits, whether fields and gardens, should we ever be likely to identify them, might not be another attractor of such deposits that we have completely overlooked so far. But in this kind of deposit, I would interpret mainly as kind of small-scale practices, because so many of them are found close to houses or inside houses or in a general settlement context. So practices, and that's probably what makes them so idiosyncratic as well. It's practices that involve a small amount of people. Some of them might be towards fertility, some of them might have entirely different motivations, quite dark motivations perhaps even, but they are all creating these micro-traditions because there are small groups of people witnessing and reproducing these, and they're also and they become very localized for this reason. Now, in the publication we made of this, I call these magical practices, but of course this is also a very loaded term. But I chose this term, now perhaps I would call it immanentist, but at the time I chose this term because I felt that a lot of the materials that were chosen in these deposits were there, sometimes in small quantities, because of the associations that they bring. So a kind of sympathetic component to the whole thing, where you think you can manipulate the environment around by using small quantities of something that is connected to the forces that you are trying to summon, in a sense. But I also chose the word magic because it, to me, conveyed at the time a little bit this sort of secretive, smaller nature, as opposed to the larger scale structured deposits that we also see, for example, at sites like Herxheim or like Vrable, okay, which are very, very different in character. These also have material with them, not with the human remains, but this is often much more selected material. At least at Herxheim, it's often the imported pottery. It's the strange animal bones, like a lot of dogs. It's the imported flint tools and so on. So in these more public settings, we get a different kind of thing that is deposited. Okay, and of course, we are still awaiting the full publication, eagerly, the full publication of all these headless skeletons. I started to wonder whether these heads and these skeletons maybe fit together. Could this solve the problem? So in this LBK setting, we see more than one kind of practice. We have these large-scale practices that are documented, but we also have the so far relatively understudied small-scale magical, for want of a better term, practices, which are very flexible, but they're also quite long-lived in their own way. So they occur from all the phases of the LBK that I have data for, not so much in the earliest, but in all the other phases of the LBK I've looked at. Okay, and regional traditions develop for like the Paris Basin, grinding stone deposits, but also very localized traditions develop, like in Franconia, as we have seen. So I think in spite of all the issues of definition and all the maybes and whens and buts, there is enough of a pattern emerging here to think that something really is there. But really it's all necessary now. It relies on everybody's help to identify this more, also in excavations that are going on now, and to try and get this sort of glimpse of everyday life concerns, everyday magic, that I think we have neglected so far. Okay. And now, as they say, for something completely different, a much more public display of structured deposition. So this is a map that I'm sure you've seen very many times of prestige goods in the 5th millennium, what in the German chronology we call the Younger Neolithic. The second part of the 5th millennium. So this is from Petrica et al., and he's showing you where the copper is mined and how it spreads across Europe all the way into the North European plain. And then he's showing you where the big jadeite axes are and how they're spreading all across west up into the North European plain. And there's these big, in this model, there's these big almost kingly characters that are supposed to be controlling this kind of trade. So you have the Varna necropolis on one end with these very rich burials. And then here in the Karnak area, Alison Sheridan and others have called them the God Kings and the Tumulus Carnassiens with these very long, nice jadeite axes. And it's a very nice map. And then you look at it and you go, what happens there? Nobody's talking to these people. Okay? These people are the Mönchshofen culture, and that's our case study for today. Okay. So why is it that they don't seem to participate in these large-scale networks at this time? Now, as we say, these large-scale networks are interpreted as a sort of precursor to the hierarchies of the developed Copper Age and of the Bronze Age. So it's all about emerging pyramidal social relations. Not everybody is equally convinced, but for example, for the Michelsberg culture, Detlef Gronenborn and others have argued that we have highly structured societies, chiefdoms even, with slave-holding chiefs who then bury some of their slaves decapitated in pits, for example. In southeastern Europe, of course, we have Warner that has been driving these interpretations of aggrandizers that monopolize the metal trade. And even as far away as Ireland, in Newgrange recently there was an article that identified divine kings on the basis of ancient DNA, of all things, that were supposed to hold this fantastic God kings, that's why I wrote God kings, that were supposed to hold power over these sorts of flows of resources. But then, so what about the Mönchshofen culture? It has been a little bit drawn into this general circle of the discussion of emerging hierarchies, because here what we find is not metal and it's not jadeite axis, but we find a new depositional tradition that is based on the position of human remains, amongst other things, in very round, very steep-sided pits that are often called storage pits in the literature, even though we don't know if grain was ever stored in them. But the point is that they're very steep and a kind of shaft going quite deep down. And often these contain more than one individual. Sometimes there's one individual in the center in a sort of regular position and then another one that appears kind of squeezed on the side, or they are sort of rearranged, right? And it's the same treatment also for animals. So this has been interpreted as a kind of, again, as a hierarchical relation where we see a main person who is buried, and then the others are supposed to be the followers in death, so kind of almost like possessions of this main burial, who are killed for the occasion and deposited alongside. And Philippe Lefranc and colleagues have argued that this sort of pattern emerges first in the Mönchshofen culture, and then spreads across a big part of southern Central Europe and then towards the Mediterranean. So potentially a big cultural innovation, but that fits this idea of emerging hierarchies. So when we began a project about the Mönchshofen culture, the first thing we asked ourselves is there actually much sign of lasting social hierarchies? And how do lasting social hierarchies emerge? And from an admittedly selective overview of the ethnographic literature, the idea we came up with was that lasting hierarchies emerge when many different functions that could potentially give you prestige in a society become bundled on one person, and when this person manages to then pass on their power to their own descendants, right? But there are many different routes towards power, and as long as these are spread across different people or different groups, then there is much more of a trans-egalitarian pattern, in the sense that, yes, individual people can gain prestige, they can gain power for a while, but it's very unstable. And they also constantly have to satisfy everybody else in their society because there's too many other people who are also competing. So, you could be a great leader in warfare, or you could derive power from interceding with the ancestors or the spirits, or there could be some kind of management issue, building a large monument or irrigation, those kinds of things. Or, of course, surplus and exchange, which is what most people have argued for the jadeite axis and the copper, that this is the source, this control of exchange is the source of power. But really, it's only a lasting hierarchy if these are lastingly combined. Right? And in many other cases, it's always a balance between these aggrandizing tendencies where some people try to monopolize wealth and political power, and sort of institutions that aim to distribute it. So if you look at Polly Wiesner's work on the Enger, for example, she's showing these longer-term cycles where there are phases when some people manage to accumulate a lot of resources, but they're always in the end compelled to hold very large feasts at which they need to give away much of their surplus, in this case in the form of pigs. And also Paul Orhem for the Amazonian areas in which he had been studying. He also found similar patterns because, especially when the landscape is still relatively open and it's possible to move away, a lot of people will, as it's called, vote with their feet. If they don't like the place where they're staying, if the person in charge is getting too tyrannical, they will pack up and leave. And ultimately that leading person is very much dependent on the work and on the contribution of others. So the stability of these hierarchies is very, very varied in that sense. And so with that as a background, I'd like to briefly introduce you to the Mönchshofen culture, and especially the Riedling enclosure, this one here, which was excavated in advance of loam extraction, I think. And there's two enclosures that are dating to this time. Then there's also an open settlement that is much later and also very exciting, but we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to just look at these two enclosure circuits. And because I otherwise always forget, many, many thanks to the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft for funding this project and to all the many, many people who helped me bring it about. Yes, we were very, very patient. In particular, Martin Szilágyi, who did the pottery analysis, on which most of this is really based. So here we have our two enclosures. And I hope you can see it. It's not the best color, I realize now on the big screen. But you see these red and green dots everywhere. And these red and green dots are, the red dots are deposits of human remains, complete or in parts. And the green dots are concentrations of other kinds of items. And you can see that these occur in pits in the interior, and they occur in the older of the two enclosures, but not in the younger one. That is here. And these deposits, this first enclosure starts at about 4,300, 4,200 BC. And here are just some of these examples. So here we have these deposits are mostly made up of pottery that has been a lot of pottery. I think our biggest one is almost 70, 75 kilos. That has been smashed in situ or not very far. It's complete or almost completely reconstructible vessels that have been kind of, making this paving. And sometimes they are associated with human remains. You can see somebody's arm poking out there. But sometimes there's just these big spreads of pottery. We also have complete skeletons that are deposited in pits by themselves with grave goods. This one here is our most richly furnished one. And you can see it's a double burial. There's a lady here and then there's a newborn child there with some items. And then we also have quite a lot of these partial human remains in various stages of partiality. And we have also not been able to put these back together as complete skeletons, partly because of the preservation, but also because there is just a lot missing, and they seem to be actually also different people that are represented even close together. So our first question was, does this variability in funerary treatment also, could we somehow connect it to hierarchy? Can we, for example, see that these more fragmented people also had a harder life? Okay. We found on the paleopathological analysis that the diversity of these treatments did not really relate to health status at all. We also found that there was no relation to dietary intake, which was very diverse across the site, but didn't correlate with mode of burial. And there was also no correlation to mobility. There's many people who are non-local, who probably come from the uplands not very far away, but they're not treated distinctively in death at all. We also didn't really find any obvious indicators of violence, although there are 2 burials that do stand out a little bit. This is one of them, and you can see this person has been squeezed on the side of the feature, and then their upper body has been turned 90 degrees to one side, there, and then their head has been turned 90 degrees more. So we hope they were dead at that point, but if not, then soon after, we think. So this is not very nice. So even though we can't see any evidence of trauma, this probably was not a good death. But on the others, there is no indication. Okay? And we have a reasonably broad demographic spectrum there. Okay, and here are some more of these partial remains. So we also have sometimes these skull concentrations in little finds, clusters, like with this anthropomorphic loom weight here. Okay. So in that sense, no real connection between the mode of burial and any other signs of status. In fact, our very richest burial, the one with the most grave goods, is the one I showed you earlier, storage pit 703, which contains this young adult female and the neonate. Unfortunately, it wasn't well preserved enough for DNA, so we don't know if the child is hers, but perhaps we can assume so. So she had some grave goods like this upper part of a pedestal bowl and various other vessels and so on. But she also had a very hard life. So she had enamel hyperplasias on her teeth that suggest some kind of malnutrition or illness when she was a young child. But she also had an infection, probably because of these tooth problems here. Always brush your teeth. And this then spread first into the inside of the skull and then also later into other parts of the body. And it's likely, or the pathologist thinks it's likely, that this kind of meningitis was eventually the cause of death, maybe in connection with also being pregnant or having just given birth. So this is not, even though it's our richest burial, this is not a person who was, in a sense, had a particularly easy life. And it almost seems, for all of these individuals that we have there, again, the burial rite is very varied. The kinds of things that they are deposited with is very varied. And it almost seems that it's a specific, almost a biographical reason, something that happened to you, the way you died, when you died, that made you be selected for this kind of deposit. So they're all, in a sense, there's no big pattern that unites them all. It seems to be a very individual choice. In total, we have about 40 of them, and none of them is like the other. But coming back to our deposits and these big spreads of material, again, and a little bit like for the bandkeramik, but even more marked, we have some more formal deposits that are whole pots, like these to here, and then this pedestal bowl over the top. But they are actually very rare, and most of the stuff is in these big, long spreads of pottery, and almost exclusively pottery. The interesting thing here is that it's not just any pottery, but it's very specifically selected and different from what goes into the remainder of the settlement pits that don't show these clear arrangements. So we have more of these sort of conical beakers and more of the serving ladles that suggest drinking. Basically, all our miniature vessels that we have from site come from these deposits. All the shapes that we had identified as atypical and maybe non-local are found in deposits. And looking at the chronological development of this, we could also show that new shapes, and Münchshofen pottery is very dynamic, there's constantly new shapes and new decorative motifs being introduced, that these new shapes first appear in structured deposits and only later spread across the remainder of the site. In addition, there's a slight tendency, though it's not statistically significant, to have bigger meat packages represented in the ditch in the vicinity of these pottery deposits. There are more bones of cattle when elsewhere it's pig. And we have flint tools where we did a use wear analysis, and it shows that the ones in the ditches with these deposits are used very slightly, only once, and mainly for butchery. Okay. So even though our lipid analysis didn't show anything special when into the pots, it's still, on the whole, we decided to interpret these as feasts, as communal consumption events for large audiences or large groups of people, because of little use and this focus on strange and exotic kinds of material. But these innovations, of course, then don't remain restricted. They spread into the wider population later. So what was interesting in this context was that we had so many non-local shapes. And when we did an analysis of the clay composition, we found that they were all made with clay that could be local. So it seems to us that we have either sort of local potters from the site that spent a long time elsewhere, learned how to make weird-looking pottery and returned and made it there, or we had perhaps visitors from far away. And I think this latter is perhaps indicated by the generally high mobility of people at the site. So here you see our strontium plot, and these are the animal bones that we have that determine our local range. This one here is the cow from space. And then we have all these individuals, and as you can see, quite a few of them fall either above or below our local range. So it seems that this site pulled in people from a much wider region around. It doesn't, as I've said, it doesn't have to be very far away. Like these sorts of uplands could be the Bohemian forest, which you can reach, I think, in a day if you try. But it shows that not everyone who was buried here was permanently resident, and of course it could be from further. What's also interesting is the things that don't end up in deposits. And we don't have any prestige goods. Right? Like, as expected, we don't have any jadeite, we don't have any metal, because there isn't any in the Mönchshofen culture, much. But we also don't really have polished stone tools of any sort. Right? The ones that we do have look like this. It's almost a little bit embarrassing. The lithic specialist looking at them said, oof. These are from Žistepsko, but our lithic specialist suggested that they are so small that people might have been scavenging Linearbandkeramik sites and resharpening the old ones. I don't know, but anyway, there is no big show-off ones. There's no nice flint tools either. It's all local material and pretty crappy, except for this one piece, this kind of dagger-shaped piece that has some similarities to pieces in the Carpathian Basin, and that where we weren't able to source the raw material for it. So that's potentially an import. But everything else, no metal, no big stones, nothing that at the same time in other regions appears to be connected to aggrandizing behavior. And this general pattern remains true of other Mönchshofen sites, although these have many fewer instances of structured deposits. But again, we see mostly behavior that is connected towards depositing pottery or depositing food. So we have, for example, 2 pigs deposited in Mamming crosswise, or here the famous Aufhausen Venus that was covered with a smashed foreign-looking pot and was in the bottom of this storage pit. So even though our feasting spreads are unique, this sort of almost deliberate avoidance of anything lithic or anything metal is valid throughout the Mönchshofen culture. Right? So again, we have degrees of formality, and in that assessment, people are right. So we have these sort of very fragmented remains. We have the squeezed people, the sort of nasty-looking people. We have the nice burials with grave goods, just like we have our nice pottery spreads and our individual items that are buried. And we sometimes have sort of big deposits of more detritus, like a lot of burnt daub in some pits, for example. So again, degrees of formality. But the storage pit phenomenon, what goes into these pits and what is buried there, is far more varied than just dead people. So we also have these kinds of deposits in ditches and in pits. Okay. So if we agree that these are feasts, how would we go about identifying how they work socially? So this is a scheme by Megan Kassabaum that was published in American Antiquity, and she tried to figure out, is it a small group size or a large group size? And what is the degree of socio-political competition by the kind of criteria that should be represented? And we tried to go through the scheme together as a team and found that actually Riedling falls unhelpfully into basically all of these categories. So we're not sure about the group size. There are lots of vessels, and they seem to be all deposited at the same time in an enclosure. But they're also, of common size. There's nothing very large. They're unusual looking, but they're not very large. And they have the typical kind of food in them. Okay? There is no exotic or recreational foods. I think she means drugs, but we haven't found any. They're all made in the same way. There's nothing specifically new that goes into them. Right? And some vessel types are very common. Others are special or high quality, so it's a mixture of the two. And of course, you have the monumental construction, and it's an atypical mode of disposal. So I think we can agree that this enclosure site, with all these people coming from outside, that the audience for these kind of events would be larger than perhaps at the average Münchhofen culture site. So there is a kind of element of aggrandizing, of showing off. But there is also an element of having to destroy all of this wealth. So I think we fall somewhere in between, I would say. It's maybe a little bit competitive, but it's not very exclusive, right? So it's nearing, it falls on the boundary, I would say. So perhaps if we have some kind of aggrandizing behavior, it's maybe not at the level of the individual. The individual burials are not very rich, either at this site or at others. And we don't have any large domestic architecture that would suggest specific families stand out. So perhaps this is maybe competition at the scale of the whole community. That this site for a while was the sort of center for a wider region, with lots of people coming in, having good parties there. Great, right? They managed to keep this up for quite a few centuries. But eventually, in the last century, already it's no longer working. So the first enclosure was full of deposits. That goes out of use around about this sort of time, for 4130 to 4015. And then the second one is dug, but it is shallower. It's not as nice. It has these big gaps, probably due to erosion, or maybe they didn't quite finish it. And it doesn't have any deposits in it anymore. So perhaps even this site, even though it was a big place for a while that people liked to go to, eventually lost its significance. Perhaps it was even only used for certain events. It's not our preferred interpretation, but we can't actually prove either way. Okay. It might be that people go away for a while and then come back and build this second enclosure afterwards, and don't manage to reproduce the earlier successes. So if we go back to our idea of lasting hierarchies, this seems to be more of a system that privileges the distribution of surplus, or at least of food-related wealth, in the context of feasts. But on top of this, we seem to have a highly mobile population. So this again would militate against the possibility of constructing very rigid hierarchies, because the more mobile people are in a landscape, the more easily they can vote with their feet, the more likely, or the less likely they are to submit to hierarchies. So there would be difficulties in maintaining any kind of bottleneck of prestige goods, because all these hard to obtain prestige goods like the stone and the metal, they're not really there at all. Right? So perhaps it's more one of these systems where we have competing positions of power, but people keep each other in check. So somebody is able to host a big feast, but it ruins them. Right? And then maybe somebody else tries it. Right? They're forced to give all their wealth away if they want to create these positions of power. And at the same time, while new, nice forms of pottery, exotic forms are introduced here, later on they spread to the community because nobody is really able to control the distribution of these things. So it looks a little bit more, rather than a pyramid social organization, it looks a little bit more like what Angelbeck and Greer have called the inverted pear shape. They have done this for the Coast Salish, and they say that, there are some people who are poor or who are rejected from societies, and perhaps this is, for example, our nasty burial in the pit that's squeezed on the side. Okay, they fall into the hands of enemies, for example, but these are relatively few, right? Or the black sheep that don't work. But most people in a society are actually the good people. So most people are good people, and any of these good people could potentially move into a leadership position, but also fall down again from a leadership position. So these positions of power are constantly cycling, and they're dependent also in Koistalisch on performances like these ritual events. Okay, then we can kind of skip. What's also interesting is that after the Mönchshofen culture, this idea of storage pits, for example, explodes. The position in storage pits happens in lots of different places for many, many centuries afterwards, but it stops almost exclusive. It basically stops completely in this area where it was allegedly first invented. So whatever they did with this ritual performance, after about the 400, 500 years of the Mönchshofen culture, it's also no longer kept up. And it seems that this end of society collapses completely into a kind of more, there's basically no more indication of any kind of inegalitarian relations at all. Okay, whereas in the regions around, we see a wide variety of depositional practices. And of course, also in the Michelsberg culture, the storage pit then really does become associated with these more sinister events of mass deposition. So just in sum for this case study, here structured deposits are more public than they were in the Bandkeramik. There may be feasting residue. And this is here that people introduce innovations, both ritual innovations, but also pottery innovations and so on. And there's a lot of investment here. There aren't any other prestige goods. People invest in this communal dimension of feasting. And this perhaps is a deliberate choice in a situation in which it wasn't possible to control people and to build a lastingly hierarchical society. Also because a much more greater mobility than in the earlier Neolithic made this hard to enforce. So there is no evidence here of these institutionalized inequalities on an individual basis, like the chiefdoms and the slaves that are argued for other areas and regions at this time. So perhaps we had inter-site competition, but again, this was unstable. Right. So as a comparison of these two, I think structured deposits in both sets of societies are, in a sense, central. It's more obvious for the Younger Neolithic because they are much more public, and it's also here that they become much more common and much more easy to document archaeologically, so we have discussed them much more. And this is how society levels itself out. But I think also for the Bandkeramik, in a different way, structured deposition is central as an everyday magical practice that perhaps is a counterbalance to the more public rituals that we see at Herxheim or at Vrabla, for example. But there is a lot of variation regionally, of course. And then finally, before this microphone also dies, thank you for your attention. And if you want to watch a film about Riedling, a former student of mine made one, and you can just type Riedling into YouTube and you will be taken there. Thank you very much.